There are 6 stages that can sometimes appear after a narcissistic person loses access to someone who was deeply emotionally invested in them. And the most important thing to understand is that these stages aren't a guaranteed psychological sequence that every person with narcissistic traits will experience in exactly the same way. People are complicated, and narcissistic behavior exists on a spectrum. But when a relationship has been organized around control, validation, emotional dependency, and repeated cycles of closeness and withdrawal, separation can expose a very predictable set of reactions. And the first stage often begins with something that looks surprisingly calm. He may appear completely fine. He may act as though your departure doesn't matter. He may tell mutual friends that he expected it. He may suddenly become extremely confident. He may post as though life has become better without you. He may even behave as though you're the person who lost something. This first stage is often about maintaining the appearance of control. Because if he immediately showed how deeply your departure affected him, he would have to acknowledge something psychologically uncomfortable. Your decision changed his emotional environment. So instead, the story may become completely different. I was already done. I never really cared. She was too much. He was too difficult. I've moved on. Notice what these statements accomplish. They transform being left into choosing to leave. They transform rejection into superiority. They transform loss into evidence that the other person was supposedly the problem. And this is where you need to be careful about interpreting outward confidence as proof of inner stability. Someone can look completely unaffected and still be experiencing considerable emotional disruption, but you also shouldn't assume that every confident display means hidden suffering. The healthier approach is to focus on what you can actually observe, and that brings us to the second stage. The second stage is often the search for replacement validation. When the old source of attention disappears, the person may begin looking for new attention elsewhere. This can happen through social media, new friendships, new romantic interests, flirting, public displays of happiness, sudden changes in appearance, constant activity. Anything that restores the feeling of being wanted, admired, or important. Again, this doesn't automatically mean someone is narcissistic. After a breakup, almost anyone can seek distraction or companionship. The important distinction is whether the new attention is being used primarily to avoid emotional processing and restore a threatened sense of importance. Sometimes the person moves rapidly from one source of validation to another because being alone with their own thoughts feels uncomfortable. And this is where the third stage can begin. The third stage is comparison. Once the initial distraction becomes less powerful, memories of the previous relationship can return. Not necessarily because the person has suddenly developed genuine insight. Sometimes they remember specific things they received from you: your attention, your patience, your emotional availability, your understanding, the way you listened, the way you made them feel important, and suddenly the new person doesn't produce exactly the same experience. This can create comparison. But comparison isn't the same thing as appreciation. Someone can miss what you provided without understanding how their own behavior contributed to losing it. That distinction matters enormously. They may miss your presence. They may miss your attention. They may miss the emotional security you provided. They may miss the way you understood them. But missing those things doesn't automatically mean they've developed the capacity to treat you differently. And this is where many people become trapped. They receive a message. Nobody understood me like you. I've been thinking about you. I miss what we had. You were different. And immediately, hope returns. But before you interpret the message as evidence of transformation, look for something much more important: accountability. Does the person clearly acknowledge what they did? Do they take responsibility without blaming you? Do they understand the impact of their behavior? Have their actions changed consistently? Or are they simply experiencing the discomfort of your absence? Those are completely different things. The fourth stage can involve testing whether the old connection is still available. This may begin subtly: a random message, a reaction to something you post, a memory from the relationship, a question that doesn't really need an answer, a mutual friend mentioning them, a sudden appearance in a familiar place. The specific behavior varies. The underlying question is often simple. Can I still reach you? And this is where your response matters more than their intention. You don't need to decode every message. You don't need to determine whether they're secretly suffering. You need to decide whether reconnecting is actually healthy for you. Because the fact that someone wants access to you again doesn't automatically mean they've become safe enough to receive it. Sometimes people return because they genuinely changed. Sometimes they return because they miss you. Sometimes they return because they're lonely. Sometimes they return because another source of attention didn't work out. Sometimes they return because they want to know whether they still have influence. The behavior alone doesn't tell you which explanation is true. Consistency does. And this is why the fifth stage can become particularly revealing. When access doesn't return easily, frustration may appear. The person may become more persistent. They may suddenly become emotional. They may become angry. They may accuse you of being cruel. They may say you've changed. They may claim you're punishing them. They may insist that you're holding a grudge. And notice the psychological shift. At first, they acted as though losing you didn't matter. Then they wanted access. Now they're upset because access isn't being restored. This is where the difference between love and entitlement becomes easier to see. Healthy love can respect another person's decision. Entitlement struggles with a boundary because it experiences the boundary as an unacceptable loss of access. And that brings us to the sixth stage, which is the stage that matters most for you. Acceptance of reality. Not necessarily their acceptance, yours. Eventually, you may realize that you don't need to know what stage they're in anymore. You don't need to monitor their social media. You don't need mutual friends to report what they're doing. You don't need to know whether they regret losing you. You don't need proof that they miss you. You don't need confirmation that leaving affected them. Your attention finally moves away from their internal world and back toward your own. And this is the point where leaving becomes more than physical separation. It becomes psychological separation, because you can leave someone's house and still spend every waking hour living inside their behavior. You can block their number and still mentally remain in the relationship. You can stop speaking to them and still spend months trying to understand why they did what they did. Real freedom begins when their next stage no longer determines your next stage. You stop asking, "What are they feeling?" and begin asking, "What am I building now?" You stop asking, "Will they come back?" and begin asking, "Why would I return to something that repeatedly damaged my peace?" You stop asking, "Do they regret losing me?" and begin asking, "Do I regret finally choosing myself?" That shift is where the entire cycle begins losing its power, because the 6 stages aren't really the most important story. Your stage is. The stage where you stop waiting for their reaction and start creating a life that doesn't require one. And this is where the separation often becomes psychologically more complicated, because leaving doesn't necessarily end the emotional dynamic immediately. The physical distance may happen in one day, but the psychological separation can take much longer. You may still remember conversations, question decisions, replay arguments, and wonder whether the other person is thinking about you. Meanwhile, they may appear completely unaffected, which can create an especially painful contradiction. You feel everything, while they seem to feel nothing. But appearances don't give you reliable access to another person's internal world. What matters is what their behavior tells you, and even more importantly, what your own experience is teaching you. The first stage we discussed, appearing unaffected, can sometimes continue for longer than expected. The person may maintain a confident public image while privately experiencing frustration, loneliness, confusion, or simply moving forward in their own way. You don't need to decide which one is happening. You don't have enough information to know, and trying to figure it out can keep you emotionally attached. This is one of the most important principles after leaving a difficult relationship. Don't turn their reaction into your evidence of whether leaving was correct. You don't need them to suffer for your decision to be valid. You don't need them to miss you. You don't need them to fall apart. You don't need them to come back. And you certainly don't need them to fail with someone else. You left because something about the relationship was no longer acceptable to you. That reason stands even if they seem completely happy afterward. And this leads directly into the second stage, replacement validation. Sometimes, after losing a significant source of attention, a person may immediately surround themselves with new people. They may suddenly become extremely social. They may appear more confident than ever. They may post pictures designed to communicate that life has never been better. If you're watching from the outside, this can be devastating. You may think, how can they be happy already? Did I mean nothing? Was everything fake? Why do they look better without me? But social presentation isn't emotional transparency. People display what they want others to see. And even if the person genuinely is enjoying their new life, that doesn't invalidate what happened in your relationship. Your worth isn't determined by how quickly someone moves on. Someone can replace a relationship quickly without replacing what you experienced inside that relationship, and someone can also genuinely move forward without ever giving you the closure you wanted. Both realities are possible. The third stage, comparison, can become more complicated because memories are rarely objective. After a relationship ends, people often remember certain moments more vividly than others. The good memories can suddenly feel enormous: the first conversations, the laughter, the trips, the private jokes, the moments when you felt completely understood. And if the other person reaches out during this period, they may talk almost exclusively about those moments. Remember when I was thinking about that night. Nobody made me laugh like you did. These statements can be emotionally powerful, but nostalgia is selective. It remembers the warmth and often temporarily forgets the cost. This is why you should never evaluate a relationship only through its best memories. A relationship isn't defined solely by how beautiful its happiest moments were. It's also defined by how safe you felt during conflict, how respected you were when you disagreed, how accountable the other person became after hurting you, whether your boundaries were honored, whether you could express your needs without being punished, whether you could trust what you were being told, and whether the relationship allowed you to remain yourself. This is where your own memory becomes important. Don't rewrite your history simply because you're lonely today. Loneliness is real. Missing someone is real. Grief is real. But none of those emotions automatically mean the relationship should be restored. Sometimes you miss a person and still know you cannot safely return to the dynamic. The fourth stage, testing access, can therefore become one of the most confusing. A simple message can create an enormous emotional reaction. Hey, how have you been? I saw something that reminded me of you. Can we talk? The message may be tiny. The emotional meaning you assign to it may be enormous. You may spend hours analyzing punctuation, timing, wording, and possible motives. But try to resist that trap. A message is simply a message until behavior gives it meaning. You don't need to determine whether they secretly want reconciliation, validation, control, closure, or another opportunity. If they genuinely want to repair something, they can communicate clearly. They can take responsibility. They can explain what has changed. They can respect your boundaries. They can demonstrate consistency. You don't need to solve the mystery for them. And if they become angry because you don't respond the way they expected, that reaction itself tells you something useful. Healthy reconnection doesn't require immediate access. A healthy person can hear "I'm not ready" and respect it. They can accept that your trust was damaged. They can understand that their previous behavior has consequences. They don't have to like your boundary to respect it. This is where the fifth stage can reveal the difference between genuine remorse and wounded entitlement. Genuine remorse tends to focus on the harm caused. Entitlement tends to focus on the access that was lost. There's a significant difference between "I understand why you don't trust me, and I know I caused that," and "How can you treat me like this after everything I've done for you?" The first recognizes your experience. The second centers their frustration. And this distinction can save you from misinterpreting emotional intensity as accountability. Someone can become extremely upset when you leave without actually understanding why you needed to leave. They can cry because they miss you without understanding the behavior that made staying impossible. They can become angry because you blocked them without acknowledging the reasons you felt blocking was necessary. Emotion alone isn't evidence of transformation. The sixth stage, your psychological separation, is therefore the most important one to focus on, because eventually you realize something that can feel almost strange. You don't actually need to know what they're experiencing anymore. You can care about what happened without continuing to monitor the person. You can remember them without checking on them. You can wonder about them occasionally without making their life a daily research project. You can acknowledge that they mattered without allowing them to remain the center of your emotional world. This is where healing becomes visible. Not when you never think about them, not when you suddenly stop caring, but when thinking about them no longer controls what you do next. And there is another important shift that happens here. You stop measuring your healing by whether you would take them back. You start measuring it by whether you trust yourself enough to make the right decision regardless of whether they return. Because imagine they suddenly came back tomorrow. Would you be able to evaluate their behavior calmly? Could you distinguish words from actions? Could you recognize the old pattern if it returned? Could you say no without feeling guilty? Could you walk away again if necessary? Those questions matter far more than whether they come back. Your goal isn't to become emotionally numb, it's to become emotionally grounded. Grounded people can still love. They can still miss. They can still grieve. But they don't allow those feelings to override reality. And reality is where your protection exists. If someone repeatedly hurt you, you don't need to turn them into a monster to justify leaving. You don't need to convince yourself they were evil. You simply need to accept that the relationship wasn't healthy enough for you. That acceptance is powerful because it doesn't require hatred. It requires honesty. And honesty is often where the cycle finally ends. And this is where the final stage becomes the most powerful, because eventually the question stops being, "What is the narcissist going through after I leave?" and becomes, "What am I becoming now that I am no longer living inside that cycle?" That shift may seem small, but psychologically it represents an enormous change. For so long, your attention may have been directed toward their moods, their reactions, their silence, their approval, their anger, and their next move. After leaving, the temptation is to continue watching from a distance. You may stop speaking to them, but continue studying them. You may block their number, but still check whether they tried another way to reach you. You may stop asking mutual friends directly, but secretly hope they mention something. You may tell yourself you're over it while still measuring your healing by whether they seem affected. And that is why leaving physically is only the beginning. The first real sign of freedom is when their reaction becomes emotionally irrelevant to your decision. Maybe they look happy. Maybe they look miserable. Maybe they move on immediately. Maybe they remain single. Maybe they talk about you. Maybe they never mention you again. None of these outcomes changes the reason you left. Your decision cannot depend on whether the other person validates it through their suffering. This is one of the hardest lessons to accept after a painful relationship. Sometimes you never get to see the consequence you imagined. You may expect them to realize what they lost. You may imagine a moment when they finally understand your value. You may picture them sitting alone, remembering everything, wishing they could go back. Maybe that happens. Maybe it doesn't. You don't know. And if your healing depends on witnessing it, you're still psychologically connected to them. Real healing sounds different. I know what happened. I know what I experienced. I know why I left. I know what I will not accept again. Those statements don't require their agreement. And that is where the sixth stage becomes your stage rather than theirs. You begin rebuilding your identity outside the relationship. At first, that can feel unfamiliar. You may not even remember what your life felt like before you became so emotionally focused on another person's behavior. You may have spent so much time managing conflict, anticipating reactions, explaining yourself, repairing tension, or trying to understand what was happening, that your own needs became secondary. Now there is space, and space can initially feel uncomfortable. You have to decide what you actually want, not what will keep someone happy, not what will prevent an argument, not what will make someone stay. What do you want? What kind of relationship feels peaceful to you? What kind of communication feels respectful? What behaviors are no longer negotiable? What boundaries are you willing to enforce? What parts of yourself did you abandon while trying to keep the relationship alive? These questions are more important than knowing whether the narcissist is currently thinking about you, because your future is built through your answers to those questions. And something else happens during this stage. The emotional story begins losing its extremes. In the beginning, you may think the person was either perfect or completely terrible. You may alternate between idealizing them and hating them. One day, you remember everything beautiful. The next day, you remember everything painful. Healing eventually allows both memories to exist at the same time. You can say, "There were moments I genuinely loved, and there were things I experienced that I will never accept again." Both can be true. You don't need to erase the good memories to honor the bad ones. You don't need to deny that you loved someone in order to recognize that the relationship harmed you. You don't need to call every moment fake. Sometimes people can give genuine affection and still behave destructively. Sometimes someone can care about you and still lack the emotional maturity required to maintain a healthy relationship. And sometimes the most painful truth is that love alone wasn't enough. This is why returning simply because someone says they miss you can be dangerous. Missing you doesn't prove they can love you differently. Missing the relationship doesn't prove they understand what destroyed it. Missing your attention doesn't prove they value your humanity. The only reliable evidence is sustained behavior. If someone genuinely changes, the change has to exist when they aren't trying to win you back. It has to exist when there is no immediate reward. It has to exist when they're frustrated. It has to exist when you disagree. It has to exist when you say no. It has to exist when they don't get what they want. That's where character becomes visible. And if those changes aren't present, then returning to the relationship simply because the person is emotional can restart the exact cycle you work so hard to escape. This is also why the idea of the 6 stages should never become another reason to monitor the narcissist. Don't sit there thinking, are they in stage 1? Have they reached stage 3? Are they finally missing me? Are they angry yet? Will they come back? That can become another form of emotional attachment. The stages are useful only if they help you understand a possible pattern and then redirect your attention toward yourself. They are not a prediction of what one specific person must do. They are not a guarantee that someone will eventually regret losing you, and they certainly aren't a reason to wait. Waiting for someone to collapse keeps your life psychologically connected to their life. Moving forward means accepting that their future belongs to them. Your future belongs to you. There is another powerful realization that often arrives after enough distance. You don't actually need revenge, because the narcissist or anyone with a pattern of manipulative behavior may spend time moving through their own reactions after losing access to you. But your responsibility isn't to track those reactions. Your responsibility is to understand why you left, protect the progress you've made, and resist the temptation to turn their response into a measure of your value. The greatest change isn't when they finally realize they lost you. It's when you finally realize that you don't need them to realize it.